You're listening to Consolidate That. Ukraine is my motherland. It is now under a savage attack by Russia. Ukraine is shielding Europe and the rest of the civilized world from Putin's barbaric aggression. Ukrainians are brave and effectively fighting back. Let's help. Make a donation to Armed Forces of Ukraine. Link is in the show notes. Hashtag Stand with Ukraine.
Welcome back to Consolidate That, Ivan. It's great to see you. Last time that we were chatting, we were in person together, which is a unique experience for us, being such a remote team. So it's good to see you again. You look nice and sun-kissed from our time in San Diego traveling around. So I'm excited to chat with our guest, though, today. So I'll hand it over to you.
Yep, Ryan. Likewise, I was surprised to see again that you have legs. In this day and age, it's hard to imagine that people have legs. Yeah, it's a good time in California. But I'm very excited about the guest today. So we have Michael Greenberg. Mike is a veterinarian working at the intersection of animal care, clinical practice, and technology. Clinically, he has worked in general practice, emergency care, and as medical director for high quality, high volume spay neuter clinics. His work is in animal shelters and animal welfare led him to develop a passion for using data and technology to help improve operation efficiency and positive outcomes for pets and people. He now splits his time between clinical practice, research, and access to veterinary care and veterinary software development. That sounds just like my wheelhouse. All of those things and the combination. It's almost like I can probably lay, lay my biography over this. So,
Cool.
so we're gonna talk about the quantification of the access to veterinary care. So, Mike, very excited to have you here on the show. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Yeah, happy to be here.
So access to care is a very dear topic to us because one of the two missions that we have at Galaxy is actually providing access to care to people where and when they need it, and pets. And but access to care could be sliced in this day and age into several planes. I
Sure.
would say one of them is just general access to care because we don't have enough vets, techs, or everybody else. Because so that's a challenge. All the clinics are having 3+ weeks, wait time. Emergencies are 6 to 8 hours, but then there's access to care due to financial constraints. So, just to kind of get us
Yeah,
started, in which plane do you play,
sure.
and what makes you excited in the morning thinking about it?
Yeah. So when I think about access to care, and I like how you put it plain, it's a more positive note than I often talk about the barriers. And I'll probably slip into talking about barriers because I'm so used to it. But I think about three or four things. I think about cost because that's the most frequently cited barrier to care that people mention in surveys and research and things like that. I think about location slash logistics and the presence of clinics, which sort of piled into that is the number of people available to provide care. So what we sometimes talk about the veterinary employee density or veterinary employee availability. And uh, with that transportation, is there a clinic there? And when I get there, is there somebody to provide me service? So all those things are sort of the second bucket.
So I was going to say, you provide this service through your group, right? The Veterinary Care Accessibility Project. I know.
Yeah, so I should sort of kick things off, kind of backing up a
Yeah.
little bit. I'm one of the co-founders of Veterinary Care Accessibility Project. Myself, and my research partner, Dr. Sue Neal, founded the project last year, and it came about out of curiosity and necessity. Sue is this amazing researcher. She has one foot in animal welfare, and her doctorate is in public administration and geographic information systems, GIS. So she has this really deep technical and policy background that I don't have. And then I bring the veterinary side of it and enough statistics and tech curiosity to be dangerous sometimes. We were doing some research in access to care at one of my previous jobs. We were working together and said, well, there must be some quantified, some metrics out there that can help us quantify access to care across the country. Let's go look for them. And we tried and we looked and we tried more and we looked more and we didn't find anything and said, man, I guess we're going to have to make this. So this project came together initially for us to create the veterinary care accessibility score, which I can talk about in a minute. And from there, as is usually the case with research, the answers brought more questions and so on and so forth. So now we've delved into other things as well. But yeah, all this is through the Veterinary Care Accessibility Project. Um, and getting to those barriers to care, the planes on which we look at this stuff. Uh, Cost is, really the first one because it's the most frequently cited. The next is logistics. So, are there veterinary clinics in an area? What's the travel situation? Can people travel to get there? Can they access a car? Can they walk there? Things like that. And then when they get there, is there someone there to serve them? So, Ivan, you mentioned the veterinary shortages, veterinary staff shortages we have. So we look at that. And then the last but not least, final barrier we look at, which is a little bit harder to quantify, are cultural differences and boundaries. So that can encompass a lot of things, but it's plain and simple as language. When I get to a clinic, do I, can I communicate with people? And do when I get to a clinic, do I feel judged? Am I in some way being judged for cultural norms and things like that? So those are the things we look at and think about when we're working on these things.
So, at the high level, what you're describing is an extremely valuable information for not only the overall mission of providing care to pets, but it's also for the companies that are building or acquiring practices, or for veterinarians in general, where the intersection of the need with the lack of access, is that the theme of the project, or is there a business model attached to it that helps you to support it?
Yeah, good question. So when we think about our audience, because we want to do research, but part and parcel to our mission is doing research that actually informs decisions, to actually affect change. One of the audience members, if you will, is what you just mentioned, service providers. So people who are acquiring or establishing clinics, we hope that they can see these areas with low access not as liabilities, but as potential business opportunities. I don't necessarily have the business background to say, and this is how you do it, but we do have the background to say, here are some spots where people need care and don't have it. So service providers are one audience. Another is the animal welfare world. The animal welfare industry has taken on a big role in the last few years at looking at access to care. Obviously, for decades, it was all about animal sheltering and shelter outcomes, and things aren't perfect there yet, but they've improved dramatically. And now looking at access to care is really the biggest challenge in animal welfare, of our current generation. The next audience member we think about are policymakers. So, can we put legislation, laws, rules, et cetera, in place to make access to care easier? And finally, we look at researchers, other people adding to this body of work, and how can we make tools that help inform their work?
So when we talk about the access to care through the, let's say, Galaxy
Yeah.
lens, we're concerned about the lack of
Hmm.
veterinarians, and then also, well, kind of both of those topics, and the lack of funds potentially. Do you think that there is or did you stumble upon the tactic or the strategy for the organizations to deal with this? Because one of the sort of quantified goals that we have in front of us as an organization is reducing economic euthanasia as close to zero as we
Yeah.
can. And did you bump into any organizations that incorporated into the for-profit organizations that incorporated any tactics to kind of combat that?
Sure. So yes, I can point to one in specific, who, by the way, would be a great podcast guest for you. There's a group called Open Door Veterinary Collective, and they're not the only example of a clinic like this, but they're one that really rises to the surface. They're started by a woman named Amy Saint Arnaud, who was in the not-for-profit veterinary world for a long time, but then said, "I'm going to start a for-profit group of clinics to show that you can provide increased access to care and do so in a for-profit model." I think for a long time, there were people, I should say, who said, well, you can only, you're only able to provide care to quote unquote those people because you can get grants and things like that. And Amy said, no, we're gonna do this in a for-profit model. And she set up two clinics. One's up in Ohio and one's down in North Carolina. And through a number of different policies and practices, they're able to increase access to care, decrease economic euthanasia. And just as one example, they have, if I remember right, I don't know what all they are, 14 different alternative payment methods that people can use that are not just care credit. That's just one example. People are doing this stuff, and I feel like it's an exciting time. I think there are other models out there that we've encountered, things like the walk-in, wellness clinic and things like that. But Open Door really jumps to mind as a great example.
So we're looking at two different things that we are doing, and I'm wondering in your sort of research or what you're seeing. Have you seen this before? But one of the things that we're leveraging is the membership model. So
Hmm.
essentially, by having a low payment sort of monthly membership, you can get access to care. At least for consultancy, which is basically your consult
Yep.
fee is waived, so you can access veterinarian anytime and through telemedicine, which is a big technological background for it, to access the areas that are more remote and even decide, do I need to drive three
Yeah.
hours to see a veterinarian? So that's sort of a teletriage combination with the telemedicine. And then the second piece that we're now doing, which we planned actually later in our strategy, but we had to do it earlier, is our nonprofit arm. So we created a nonprofit arm that essentially will raise funds. And right now, we're actually helping people in Ukraine that are in the middle of the
Okay.
war and can't get access to care. And we have over 200 volunteers helping through
Wow.
telemedicine technology, Ukrainian people, over 1,000 people a week,
Wow.
to actually provide care. So this is a model that we said, okay, we have an example. We wanted to do it later, but because the war started, and we have, no, well, I'm Ukrainian,
Yeah.
and we have quite a few employees in Ukraine, and it's been phenomenally successful over there. So we want to replicate the same model
Yeah.
here. And essentially, the nonprofit arm is our plan is basically to raise funds through different initiatives, and then having that to pay for services, and also then as a profit organization, when there's someone in need for care but they can't afford it, then donate sort of the full cost of the procedure, but then get a tax advantage on it. So that's the sort of the plan that we have for that, to kind of do the combination of doing good by not completely subsidizing things, but actually getting the
Yeah.
benefit from the tax perspective. Have you seen anything like that
So from
done?
the tax perspective, that's, at least in my experience, that's unique, and I think it's a great idea. Um, Certainly in our research and in some of the work that we've done to try to establish access to care programs, that idea of, we don't need to subsidize the whole thing, we might just need to give a little bit of help, is central, I believe, to us helping to figure this problem out, or to meet the challenge. I think for years and years, in the years that I've been, in the trenches in clinical practice doing this work, there was this notion that, oh, we have to subsidize everything 100%. And needless to say, that's not really sustainable, and it's not really necessary. I think that one of the things that we've seen with, speaking to models, as you mentioned before, um, is the idea that we don't have to shoot for an average client transaction of $0 to address access to care. We just have to shoot for something lower than, you guys know it off the top of your heads probably better, certainly better than I do, but last I heard it was in the 180 to $200 or something like that. If we can drive that down to some X that's between 0 and 200, we're helping out. And I think that, the models that you just mentioned will certainly help to do that. Mentioned, by the way, with the idea of telemedicine, we're big proponents of it from a cost reduction standpoint. One of the things that we're about to embark on some research on is trying to look at the the efficacy of reducing cost and unnecessary. I always underline 4 times unnecessary visits to the vet through telemedicine. And so I think that's a great way to go from a sort of wonky research standpoint. When we look at the access to care problem, at its core, to some degree, it's a supply and demand curve problem. And if we want to increase access, we really only have 2 options. We can increase supply or we can reduce demand. We talk a lot about increasing supply, which is important, but I believe that teletriage and telemedicine can reduce, again, unnecessary demand. You mentioned the idea of, do I need to drive 3 hours to the clinic? Um, it's always a bummer for all parties involved when that person shows up and says, this really could have waited till Monday, or you could have, you know, done such and such at home. So I think both those things are really good things to think about.
And then on the contrary, then that person will be embarrassed next time, and those are the ones that show up and say, "My dog was vomiting blood for 5 days. Should I come in?"
Right.
So
Exactly.
that's
Yeah. Yeah. And then you have the dog who is vomiting blood sitting in the waiting room waiting for the dog who doesn't need to be there to get out and so on. And then everyone's frustrated, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, telehealth, teletriage. Let's get on that.
Mike, is there a way that you all quantify? I know we used that word at the beginning,
Sure.
but a way that you really look at putting numbers around each one of these things to be able to figure out where the care is, where it needs to
Sure.
be, and any research you guys have done around that.
Yeah. So I mentioned the veterinary care accessibility score. That was the first project that we put forth under VCAP, the Veterinary Care Accessibility Project. And the VCAS, the Veterinary Care Accessibility Score, is what's called it's an index. It's a ranked index that takes variables related to all those barriers, or to at least a good handful of them, and digest them into a single number. So it's similar to, a lot of indices that we're used to hearing about, consumer price index and things like that, where it digests a bunch of numbers and puts one number as summarizes them, I should say, with a single number. And so the VCAS has, going into it, variables surrounding poverty, surrounding income, surrounding access to transportation, language, and on the veterinary side, its main veterinary, I'll call supply variable, is the number of employees per 1,000 pet owning households. So by bringing all those things together and applying a single number, we're able to start painting a picture literally. So there's maps on our website. It's access-to-vetcare.org. Start painting a picture of exactly what you said, where care is and where care isn't. Refining that constantly. We're trying to improve it, but that was our initial stab at it, and it's been interesting.
so there are other metrics that you mentioned, and one that was interesting is then the number of veterinary employees. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So one of the things that has been so I like doing this stuff because I get to learn. I'm one of those people who really loved being in vet school. Uh, I just like learning stuff. And one of the things I love about working with Sue is all that I've gotten to learn about, how to go about doing this research that happens at scale. How do we look at something across the whole country? And the one of the first questions we always ask from a really practical standpoint is, where can we get the data? Because in a practical sense, we can't go out and survey, you know, 100 million people every time we want an answer to something. We have to go seeing what are some available data sources. And I've been really happily surprised at what is available out there and what we can take and slice and dice to find answers. And we don't have to slice and dice that much. So one of the a data set that we access through um, Esri tools, ArcGIS, uh, involves just characteristics of all businesses across the United States. Um, and with that, we filter down to veterinary hospitals, veterinary clinics, and we can see how many employees do you have. So it's that simple. We don't see how many vets you have, but we see how many veterinary excuse me, how many veterinary employees we have. So we looked at that at the county level. We could have chosen other geographies, but the county kind of makes sense to a lot of people, and it's granular enough without being so granular as to get into privacy issues and things like that. Uh, we looked at number of veterinary employees at the county level, and then normalized that to, in this case, the number of pet owning households, to be able to compare uh, one area to another that might have vastly different number of households, but creating that normalized metric allows us to compare places. And we saw, it wasn't too surprising, but we saw pretty wild variations across the country. And I think that one of the things that's important to mention is that we never are trying to set a benchmark. I think it would be foolish for us to say, you know what, you should have 4 veterinarians per 1,000 household. That's ideal. We don't know what ideal is. That's not, maybe we will at some point, but we certainly don't know that now. But what we can say definitively based on our work is, what's the mean? What's the arithmetic average? Because that's just a number, right? Just add that up. And one of the things that we did once we looked at all the counties and then did it by state, uh, we did just ask the question, what's the gap to the mean? So about 1,000 counties of the roughly 3,500 counties in the country, about 1,000 counties have a deficiency of some sort, deficiency in terms of getting to the mean. If we look at the state level, that deficiency is about 25,000 veterinary employees. If we look at the county level, that number actually rises to about 60,000. There's, if you sort of look at it, there's math that makes sense as to why the county level would be higher. The state level, you can have a state where you have some counties who are doing great. They might have a super, glut of veterinary employees, and so they sort of smooth out the data. But when you look at the county level and look more granularly, the uh, the places that are challenged really start to rise to the surface. But take home message is, when we look at the number of vet employees per 1,000 pets, and then look at just the absolute numbers of veterinary employees who might be needed to meet the median, um, we hit a number of in the 50 to 60,000 range, which to me, I had to go back and do the math like 6 times, because I was like, I knew this was a problem, but man, this is the problem. Importantly, like I always talk about when we talk about these numbers, we're talking about veterinary employees. That's anyone who works in a veterinary hospital. It's not veterinarians. But I would kind of put the question, part of the question, back to you all with your background. My understanding has always been that you look at roughly a 1 to 4 or 1 to 5 ratio of veterinarians to support staff in a hospital. And so just doing the back of the envelope math, that still puts us at about 10,000 veterinarians short of bringing everybody up to the mean. And that's a hard number to
Yeah,
swallow.
that's that's crazy. I wonder if there is an additional data point that you can bring into this to actually to get to normal, which you mentioned before. That is hard to is overlap that with a wait period when you get appointment in a particular area, because maybe that will give you an ideal area. Maybe you want to be able to book an appointment within the same week,
Right.
and then depending on that mixed with this data point, maybe you will find the sort of the ideal is to have X number of veterinary professionals per square uh, or per
Yeah.
county, because you can get appointment the same week. But that's just my that's what I was
Yeah, no, and I
thinking
think
when
that's
you were
that's a
talking.
good example of when we start trying to look at benchmarking, what would,
Mhm.
ideal start to look like. And if, that's a hard number right there. Can everybody who wants an appointment get an appointment within a week? It's a reasonable sort of benchmark to put forth. I like that.
Yeah, might be
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah. Well, we always ask, one question before we wrap up. If anybody wants to find out more information about it or access to the information that you're researching, because I can see how this is highly applicable to the veterinary business as individual veterinarians that want to pursue building a hospital in an area with a demand, as well as the consolidators that are growing by de novo or looking into purchasing practices. So where do they find all of this wisdom and the information, and how can they access it?
Sure. So our website is hopefully pretty easy to remember. It's accesstovetcare.org. So if you just go to accesstovetcare.org, the maps that I referenced and the publications that we're putting out are all up there. So accesstovetcare.org.
That's great, Mike. And then outside of all of the incredible things that you guys have put together, what would be a book that you would recommend for others to read to sort of gain some other knowledge?
Yeah. So I was thinking about this. Actually, recently I ride bikes a lot, and I was on long rides. Sometimes there's not much to talk about after a while. And I was talking to my friends about this. One book I would look at that I love is Temple Grandin, Animals Make Us Human. I just love just all this, just the story of humans and animals and how old that story is, and just the truth in that statement, how animals make us human. So that always inspires me, especially if I get a little down about these things. And the other book that is sort of along the same lines and has always been an inspiration to me is actually not a book but a movie called Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control, which is an Errol Morris documentary from, it's probably 40 years old at this point, but it's about our human relationships with nature, how it can control us and how we try to control it. And at the same time, it's about utilitarian philosophy, how we can, achieve the greatest good for the greatest number and not let perfect be the enemy of good, as it's often said. So those are two things that inspire me, and check them out.
That's awesome. Those are great. Well, Mike, thank you so much. I think there's been, obviously, a ton of great information and a lot of fantastic things that people are going to be flooding the website with, because you've got a lot of really cool resources there. Again, we always appreciate having unique people from around the industry join us. So thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for joining us on the show
Thank
today.
you. It's been a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much for listening to Consolidate That. If you want to hear our new episodes, please find us on any podcast platform. Also, you can learn more about us on our website at vetintegrations.com.